There is a particular kind of tiredness that sleep does not cure. You can feel it even after a full night in bed, even after a vacation, even after scrolling until your eyes ache and the world goes quiet. It's not in the muscles. It's not even in the mind, at least not in the obvious way. It sits deeper, a hollow pressure behind the ribs, a sense that something essential is missing but you can't name what it is. You wake up and the day is already heavy, not tragic, not dramatic, just dull, as if life has been drained of a certain color you vaguely remember from somewhere else. You go through the motions, you answer messages, you work, you eat, you laugh at the right moments, and yet, in the background, there's this quiet question tapping at the glass of your awareness. Is this really it? Is this what all the effort was for? You don't ask it out loud because it sounds ungrateful. You're supposed to be fine. You have more comfort than any generation before you. More choice, more information, more freedom. And yet something inside you feels starved. Sometimes the emptiness shows up as restlessness. You can't sit still. You reach for your phone without thinking. You open apps you don't even enjoy. You refresh pages that haven't changed. Sometimes it shows up as numbness. You stop feeling deeply, not because you've made peace with life, but because you're quietly exhausted by it. Sometimes it shows up as anxiety, a constant low-grade fear that you're falling behind, wasting time, missing something important that everyone else seems to understand. You might tell yourself that you just need a new goal, a new relationship, a new city, a new version of yourself. And so, you chase, you optimize, you self-improve, you listen to podcasts at double speed, read summaries instead of books, skim instead of sit. You are always preparing to finally arrive somewhere, and yet the arrival never comes. The emptiness simply changes outfits. At night, when things slow down and there's no one to perform, the feeling becomes harder to ignore. You replay conversations, you question your choices, you imagine alternate lives where you said yes instead of no, left instead of stayed, tried instead of hesitated. You wonder if you missed the moment when life was supposed to make sense. You wonder if everyone else is secretly pretending too. What makes this emptiness so unsettling is not just that it hurts, but that it's vague. Pain with a clear cause can be addressed, a broken bone can be set, a fever can be treated. But this is like hunger when you don't know what food you need. You try to fill it with achievement, with pleasure, with distraction, and it only grows stranger. Quieter maybe, but deeper. Long before algorithms learned how to hold attention hostage, long before productivity became a moral virtue, long before identity was something you curated and displayed, there were people who noticed this same hollow feeling. They lived in worlds without electricity, without modern medicine, without global communication, and yet they recognized the same internal tension. They saw people surrounded by wealth who felt poor inside. They saw people obsessed with status who were secretly afraid. They saw minds pulled apart by desires that multiplied faster than they could be satisfied. They didn't call it emptiness in the modern sense. They spoke of unrest, of inner fragmentation, of a soul at war with itself. They noticed how easily the human mind hands over its peace to things it cannot control, and how willingly it forgets the few things it can. What's striking is not that modern people feel empty, but that we are surprised by it. We were promised fulfillment as a byproduct of comfort, meaning as a side effect of success. Happiness is something that could be engineered if we just arrange the external pieces correctly. And when that promise fails, we assume something is wrong with us, rather than with the promise itself. The ancient thinkers I'm pointing toward understood something that now feels almost subversive. They understood that the human mind does not suffer primarily because it lacks pleasure, but because it lacks orientation. It doesn't know what it's for. It doesn't know what matters. And when a mind has no clear sense of what is essential, it becomes vulnerable to everything. Imagine a ship at sea with no destination. It doesn't matter how advanced the ship is, how comfortable the cabins are, or how skilled the crew might be. Without a direction, every wave becomes a threat, every wind feels hostile, and every moment feels strangely anxious. Movement without meaning becomes exhausting, and that exhaustion, over time, turns into emptiness. Modern life is full of motion, constant updates, constant demands, constant comparisons, but very little direction that speaks to the inner life. You are told what to want, but not how to want well. You are. taught how to compete but not how to be at peace. You are trained to manage impressions, not to understand yourself. The old Stoics would say that emptiness is not the absence of things, but the absence of alignment. It's what happens when your attention is invested almost entirely in what you cannot command. Other people's opinions, unpredictable outcomes, fragile possessions, imagined futures. The mind becomes scattered, stretched thin across 1,000 concerns, none of which it can fully hold. Marcus Aurelius, who ruled an empire and still wrote to himself like a man trying to stay sane, understood that the feeling of inner poverty often appears in the middle of external abundance. He saw that you can have power, admiration, and security and still feel internally dislocated, because the mind, when it is not trained, will always find a way to be dissatisfied. Epictetus, who began his life as a slave, saw the same pattern from the opposite side. He watched people with very little suffer less than people with much, simply because they had learned to place their sense of self in something stable. He noticed that when your identity depends on things that can be taken from you, your inner world is permanently fragile. What they were pointing to again and again was a simple but uncomfortable truth. Most of our emptiness comes from outsourcing our sense of worth, meaning, and peace to forces outside our control. We build our inner life on foundations that were never meant to carry that weight. Approval, success, comfort, certainty. When those foundations shift, and they always do, the structure collapses inward. Modern psychology now circles this same insight with DI. Efferent language, we talk about locus of control, about intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation, about identity diffusion and existential anxiety. But the core remains unchanged. A mind that does not know where to stand will feel empty no matter how much it acquires. The Stoics did not promise happiness as a constant emotional high. They were deeply suspicious of that idea. Instead, they spoke about tranquility, clarity, steadiness, a state where the mind is no longer dragged around by every impulse and fear. A state where you can experience joy without clinging to it, and pain without being shattered by it. To them, emptiness was a signal, not a verdict. It was the mind's way of saying that it had been misused, that attention had been scattered, that values had been borrowed rather than chosen. And the solution was not to add more stimulation, but to subtract confusion. They believed that most people live as if their thoughts were facts, their fears were prophecies, and their desires were orders. And when you live that way, the inner world becomes crowded and loud. There is no room for depth, no space for stillness. The emptiness you feel is not because there is nothing inside you, but because everything inside you is fighting for control. One of the most radical ideas they offered was that peace does not come from getting what you want, but from wanting what aligns with your nature as a rational, social, mortal being. That sounds abstract until you really sit with it. They were saying that a human being thrives not by endless consumption, but by coherence, by living in a way that makes internal sense. They observe that the mind suffers most when it is divided. When one part wants status, another wants rest, another wants approval, another wants escape. When your actions are driven by impulses you don't examine, you slowly lose trust in yourself, and that loss of self-trust feels like emptiness. Think about how often you act against your own quiet understanding. You know when you're numbing instead of nourishing. You know when you're avoiding instead of facing. You know when you're chasing something because others value it, not because it speaks to your deeper values. Each time you do this, the mind takes note, not consciously, but somatically. A small fracture forms between who you are and how you live. Over time, those fractures accumulate, and what you experience as emptiness is often the echo of that internal distance, the feeling that you are not fully inhabiting your own life. The Stoics would say that the cure is not self-indulgence but self-reclamation, bringing your attention back from the noise of the world to the discipline of your own judgments, learning to notice the moment where an external event becomes an internal disturbance, and gently interrupting that process. They train themselves to ask again and again, what is actually within my power here, not as a philosophical exercise, but as a psychological anchor. Because when you stop demanding that the world provide your sense of meaning, you free enormous amounts of mental energy. You stop negotiating with chaos. Modern emptiness is often amplified by comparison. You are exposed to carefully edited versions of other people's lives, and your mind fills in the gaps with fantasy. You assume they are fulfilled, aligned, confident, and so your own quiet doubts feel. Personal failures. The The Stoics were acutely aware of this trap. Even without social media, they warned against measuring your life with borrowed rulers. They understood that the mind becomes restless when it is always looking sideways, when it is more concerned with how life appears than with how it is lived. Emptiness grows in that sideways glance because attention is never fully present. There is also the question of suffering, which modern culture tries desperately to eliminate. Discomfort is framed as a problem, boredom as a pathology, difficulty as a sign you're doing something wrong. The Stoics took a different view. They believed that a life without friction produces a weak and dissatisfied mind. That meaning often emerges not in spite of difficulty, but through it. When you avoid all discomfort, you also avoid depth. You never test your values. You never find out what you can endure. And without that knowledge, the self remains shallow. Emptiness thrives in that shallowness. They practiced voluntary simplicity not because they hated pleasure, but because they wanted to remain free from it. They wanted to enjoy what came without becoming dependent on it. That freedom created an inner solidity that modern people often lack. When you know you can be okay with less, you stop feeling hollow when you don't have more. Another insight they offered feels almost dangerous today. They encouraged regular reflection on mortality, not as a morbid obsession, but as a clarifying force. They believed that remembering the finite nature of life sharpens values. It cuts through trivial concerns. It exposes how much energy is wasted on things that do not matter. Modern emptiness is often the result of living as if time were infinite. Days blur together, choices feel reversible, urgency dissolves, and without urgency, meaning thins out. When everything can be done later, nothing feels essential now. By keeping death in view, the Stoics anchored themselves in the present. Not in a hedonistic way, but in a grounded, intentional way. They asked themselves whether their actions were worthy of a limited life. That question alone can fill a great deal of emptiness. The solution they pointed toward was not dramatic transformation, but steady alignment. Living in accordance with reason, acting with integrity even when no one is watching, accepting what cannot be changed without resentment, taking responsibility for the quality of one's inner life. This kind of life does not look impressive on the surface. It does not guarantee constant pleasure or external success, but it produces something rarer and more durable, self-respect. And self-respect is one of the most powerful antidotes to emptiness. When you respect yourself, you no longer need the world to constantly reassure you. You still enjoy praise, but you are not hollow without it. You still pursue goals, but they no longer define your worth. You still feel pain, but it does not confuse you about who you are. The Stoics believe that meaning is not found, but generated through action aligned with virtue. Not virtue as moral posturing, but as practical wisdom. Courage in facing reality, temperance in desire, justice in dealing with others, wisdom in judgment. These were not abstract ideals to them. They were psychological tools. A mind that practices these qualities becomes quieter, not EMP. Thank you, but spacious. There is room for thought, room for feeling, room for silence. The constant hunger for more begins to ease, not because life gives you everything, but because you stop asking it to. Modern people feel empty because they have been taught to look outward for answers that can only be found inward. And inward, in this case, does not mean indulging every emotion or impulse. It means taking responsibility for the structure of your own mind. The Stoic answer is not to escape the world, but to engage with it more skillfully, to stop being surprised by its instability, to stop expecting it to complete you, to build a center that remains intact whether things go well or badly. Emptiness fades when you know what you stand for, when your days, however ordinary, are expressions of chosen values rather than reactions to pressure, when you accept that some dissatisfaction is part of being human, and you stop treating it as a personal defect. The strange thing is that when you stop trying to fill the emptiness directly, it often dissolves on its own. When you stop asking life to entertain you, and instead ask how you can meet it with clarity and dignity, something settles. The Stoics would tell you that you are not broken, you are distracted, pulled in too many directions, carrying expectations that were never yours to begin with, and the way back is not through intensity but through attention. Attention to your judgments, attention to your habits, attention to what you can shape and what you must accept. In that attention, slowly the hollow space begins to fill, not with noise, but with presence, not with certainty, but with steadiness. And perhaps that is the real solution, not to eliminate emptiness forever, but to understand it well enough that it no longer frightens you, to see it as a signpost rather than a sentence, to let it guide you back to a life that makes sense from the inside out. So where does that leave you, standing here with this quiet understanding settling in? Not with a dramatic revelation, not with fireworks or instant relief, but with something subtler and more demanding. Responsibility, not the heavy, guilt-soaked kind, but the sober realization that your inner life is not something that happens to you. It is something you participate in, whether consciously or not. The emptiness you feel is not proof that life is meaningless. It is proof that your mind is asking for coherence. It is asking you to stop scattering yourself across every desire, every fear, every comparison, every imagined future. It is asking you to come home. The Stoics never believed that life would become easy once you understood it. They believed it would become clearer. And clarity, while less glamorous than happiness, is far more powerful. Clarity allows you to endure without becoming bitter, to enjoy without becoming dependent, to lose without collapsing inward. When you stop treating emptiness as an enemy, it loses much of its power over you. You begin to see it as a message rather than a verdict, a sign that something in your way of living, thinking, or valuing is out of alignment. And alignment is something you can work on quietly, patiently, without anyone's permission. This is where modern people often become uncomfortable, because alignment cannot be purchased, it cannot be downloaded, it cannot be validated by strange. It requires a kind of honesty that feels almost radical in a world built on performance. You have to admit when your desires are borrowed, when your goals are inflated, when your habits are numbing rather than nourishing. The Stoics would tell you that nothing external needs to change before this work begins. Not your job, not your relationship, not your location. Those things may change later, but the real work starts internally, with the way you interpret events, with the standards you hold yourself to, with the boundaries you place around your attention. Attention is your most precious resource, though modern life treats it like an infinite well. Where your attention goes, your life follows. When it is constantly pulled toward outrage, comparison, fantasy, and fear, the result is predictable: fragmentation, fatigue, emptiness. When it is trained to return to what is within your control, something stabilizes. You begin to notice that you don't need to have an opinion about everything. You don't need to react to every impulse. You don't need to win every internal argument. The mind grows quieter, not because it is suppressed, but because it is no longer panicking. The Stoics practiced this daily, often in very small ways. They prepared their minds for difficulty rather than being shocked by it. They reminded themselves that praise and blame were fleeting, that bodies age, that plans fail, that people disappoint, not to become cynical, but to remain sane. When you stop demanding permanence from a temporary world, you suffer less. Modern emptiness often comes from the belief that life owes you a certain feeling, fulfillment, excitement, constant meaning. The Stoics rejected that expectation entirely. They believed life owes you nothing except the opportunity to respond well to what happens. And paradoxically, that belief removes a tremendous amount of pressure. You no longer have to feel amazing to live well. You no longer have to wait until motivation appears. You act according to your values, and the feelings follow when they follow, or they don't. Either way, you remain intact. This is not a denial of emotion. The Stoics felt deeply, they grieved, they loved, they feared. But they refused to let those emotions dictate their identity or their ethics. They understood that emotions are information, not commands. When you internalize that, the inner world becomes more spacious. Emptiness also fades when you accept that a meaningful life is often repetitive and quiet. Modern culture romanticizes intensity, breakthroughs, peak experiences, reinvention. The Stoics found meaning in consistency, in showing up, in doing small things well, in acting with integrity when no one is watching. There is something deeply stabilizing about that approach. When your sense of worth is tied to how you act rather than how you feel, you stop chasing emotional validation. You stop oscillating between inflated hope and quiet despair. Life becomes steadier, less dramatic, but more real. You also begin to understand that suffering, while not desirable, is not an interruption of life. It is part of it. The Stoics did not seek pain, but they did not waste it either. They believed difficulty reveals character, sharpens judgment, and clarifies priorities. When you stop seeing hardship as a personal injustice, it loses some of its sting. Modern emptiness is often accompanied by the fear of missing out, the sense that someone else is living the life you were supposed to have. The Stoics would gently dismantle that idea. They would remind you that every life contains trade-offs, that no path is free of loss, that imagining alternative lives is a form of mental exile. You are here. This is your life. Not the one you planned, not the one you envy, not the one you fear you should have lived. The one in front of you. Meaning does not come from escaping it, but from inhabiting it fully with awareness and intention. When you begin to live this way, the emptiness doesn't disappear overnight. It softens, it becomes less sharp, less personal. You stop asking, "What's wrong with me?" and start asking, "What is this moment asking of me?" That shift alone can change the texture of your days. The Stoics believe that peace comes from making yourself internally reliable, from knowing that no matter what happens, you will meet it with reason rather than panic, with character rather than collapse. That kind of trust in yourself fills a space that no amount of external success ever can. And perhaps that is the deepest lesson. Emptiness is often the absence of self-trust, the feeling that you are drifting through your own life without a compass. Stoicism offers you that compass, not by giving you answers, but by teaching you how to orient yourself. It asks you to clarify what matters, to accept what you cannot control, to act well in what you can, to remember that your time is limited, to treat your mind as a garden that requires discipline, not indulgence. This path is quiet. It will not make you impressive. It may even make you less reactive, less dramatic, less consumed by trends and outrage, but it will make you steadier, and steadiness in a chaotic world is a form of strength that is easy to underestimate. If there is one thing to carry with you, let it be this. You do not need to fill the emptiness with noise. You need to meet it with honesty. Listen to what it reveals about your values, your habits, your attachments. Let it guide you back to what is essential. The Stoics believe that a good life is not one without struggle, but one where struggle does not confuse you about who you are. When you live from that place, the emptiness no longer defines you. It becomes just another passing state, like weather moving through the sky. And slowly, without force, without spectacle, something else takes its place. Not constant happiness, not certainty, but a quiet sense of groundedness. A feeling that whatever comes, you are standing on something solid.